The winter of 1887 did not arrive in the Peace River country of the Northwest Territories it invaded. It came down from the north like a living thing, swallowing the sky in 3 flat gray hours and burying the Mackenzie Trail under 4 feet of silence. For 23-year-old Mavis Holt, the season's arrival was not a poetic event. It was arithmetic. 1 cord of birch left in the woodpile, 2 jars of preserved beans, and a half-wheel of hard cheese in the cold cellar. 3 months, at minimum, before the pass road would thaw enough to see a supply wagon. And her father-in-law, Edmund Tully, had not come back from the upper trapline in 6 days. Mavis stood at the single window of the claim cabin, its glass so fogged with cold that the outside world was little more than a pale smear. Beside her, her 7-year-old son, Percy, pressed his nose against the frost, breathing small circles of warmth onto the pane. "Is Grandpa Edmund coming today, Mama?" He said he would, Mavis answered, which was not the same thing as yes. She had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Robert Tully, had fallen through the ice of the Halfway River the previous January, hauling a loaded sled before sunrise. He had been 26 years old, broad-shouldered and careful, a man who checked the ice thickness twice before trusting it. The river had disagreed with him anyway. They had recovered his body 4 days later, downstream, still wearing his fur mitts. Robert's father, Edmund, 71 and stubborn as frozen ground, had refused to leave the claim. This land fed 3 generations of Tullys, he had told Mavis in the particular tone he used when a conversation was finished. It'll feed 3 more. He had stayed, and so had Mavis, because she had nowhere else to go and no money to get there, and because the claim was the only thing Robert had left behind that still held value. Edmund had left for the upper trapline on the 9th of November. He should have returned by the 14th. On the morning of the 15th, Mavis put Percy in his heaviest wool coat, told him to stay inside and keep the iron stove fed, and pulled on Robert's oversized moose-hide boots. She stuffed the toes with rags the same way she did every morning, grabbed the hand axe and the old lever-action Marlin rifle from the wall rack, and stepped outside. The cold caught her like a thrown fist. 40 below, perhaps colder. The kind of cold that made the birch trees crack in the dark like rifle shots, and froze the hair inside your nose before you'd taken 3 steps. She followed the frozen creek north, toward the trapline trail. Edmund had blazed it himself 40 years earlier, and the cuts in the spruce bark were old and dark, barely visible beneath the snow load on the branches. Mavis moved quickly, her breath coming in short white bursts, her ears scanning through the silence for anything that didn't belong. She found the blood half a mile in. It was a dark stain in the new snow, already crusting at the edges, and it did not belong to an animal. The drag marks were wrong for that, too broad, too deliberate. She followed them off the trail and into a stand of black spruce, her heart climbing into her throat, the Marlin up and ready. He was not Edmund Tully. The man was enormous and entirely unfamiliar, slumped against the base of a spruce with his back to the bark, and his long legs stretched out before him in the snow. He was dressed for serious winter, sealskin parka, moose-hide trousers, heavy double-laced moccasins, but the parka was soaked dark along his left side, and his face was the color of old tallow. His right hand rested on the stock of a Remington rifle lying across his thighs. His left hand clutched a canvas dispatch satchel to his chest, with the single-minded grip of a man who has decided not to let go of something no matter what happens to him. He was breathing, barely. Mavis stood 10 feet away, her own rifle trained on his chest, and she thought about all the things she knew to be true about strange men in the wilderness. She thought about Robert, and about Percy alone in the cabin with the stove, and about the 3 months of winter ahead. She thought about how, if this man died here, he would be frozen solid by nightfall and unrecoverable until May. His eyes opened. They were dark brown, fever-bright, and unfocused, but they found her immediately with an alertness that surprised her. "Don't," he rasped. His voice was sand over gravel. "Don't? Hargrove's men, they're still." His head dropped forward. Mavis lowered the Marlin an inch. Hargrove, she knew that name. Everyone along the Peace River knew that name. Cecil Hargrove was the largest landowner and fur broker in the territory, a man who ran his operation from a fine house in Grande Prairie, and whose agents collected lease agreements and promissory notes the way other men collected debts owed by the dead. He had sent a man to the Tully claim twice since Robert died, offering to buy out the timber and mineral rights, for a figure Mavis had recognized immediately as an insult. She looked at the dispatch satchel. She looked at the blood soaking steadily through the sealskin. "Lord forgive me," Mavis said to no one in particular, and she slung the marlin over her shoulder and grabbed him under the arms. Getting him back to the cabin took the better part of 2 hours. The man weighed what she estimated to be 230 pounds and was entirely without the ability to help her. Mavis dragged, stopped, breathed, dragged again. Twice she fell in the snow and lay there for a moment, simply staring up at the white sky between the spruce crowns, wondering if she had lost her mind. Both times she got back up. Percy appeared at the cabin door when she was still 50 yards out, his small face going white. "Mama, who is that? Help me with the door, Percy. Get it open and stand back." Together, they got him inside. Percy held the lantern while Mavis cleared the hide rug by the stove and they eased the man down onto it. Percy stood with his back pressed against the wall, watching with enormous eyes. "Is he a bad man?" "I don't know yet," Mavis said honestly, already pulling at the laces of the sealskin parka. "But he's a dying one, which matters more right now. Fetch me the kettle, the clean rags from the trunk, and your grandfather's bottle of rye from the shelf. Don't spill it." The wound was a single bullet hole high on the left side beneath his arm, and it had gone clean through, which was the only good news. Mavis had delivered 2 calves, set a broken finger for Edmund, and once stitched a 4-inch gash in Robert's forearm with thread from her sewing box. She had never dug a bullet out of a living person. She was grateful, at least, that she would not have to tonight. She sterilized her sewing needle in the flame of the oil lamp. She poured the rye whiskey over the wound front and back, and the man's entire body went rigid, a sound coming out of him that she would not describe to Percy, who she had sent to the far corner of the cabin with instructions not to look. She stitched. She packed the wound with clean wool and bound his chest tightly with strips torn from the hem of her second-best petticoat. She was sorry about the petticoat for approximately 4 seconds. By the time she sat back on her heels, her hands were trembling and the stove needed feeding, and Percy had fallen asleep in the corner chair with his chin on his chest. The fever came on by midnight. Mavis sat beside the man through the long dark hours, bathing his face with cold water and listening to the broken, feverish things he said. Most of it was incoherent, names she didn't recognize, fragments of argument. But 2 things repeated clearly enough that she began to write them down on the back of an old supply receipt. Survey stakes. North Quarter. All of it. And, "Don't let Hargrove file before the thaw." She looked at the dispatch satchel, which she had moved to the table when they brought him in. She looked at it for a long time before she opened it. Inside were papers unlike anything Mavis had seen outside of a government office. Careful ink drawings covered in topographical lines, notations about elevation and soil composition and water depth, triangulation marks that corresponded to landmarks she recognized. The Halfway River, the North Quarter of the Upper Peace River Valley, the Tully claim, labeled precisely and enclosed within a larger boundary she did not immediately understand. There was a letter with an official seal from the Dominion Land Survey Office in Ottawa, addressed to one Gareth Kane, licensed surveyor, authorizing him to complete the geological and hydrological assessment of Peace River District Lot 7 through 22 by the 1st of December 1887. Beside his name, in the margin, someone had written in pencil, "Do not file. Hargrove." The 2 words had been crossed out, then written again underneath. As if the writer could not make up their mind about something, Mavis placed the papers very carefully back into the satchel and buckled the flap. She looked at the unconscious man on her floor. Cecil Hargrove had been buying up claim lots in the North Quarter for 3 years. He had told anyone who asked that he wanted the timber. But the Tully claim backed onto a section of the Peace River that Edmund had always said ran strange. Too fast for the volume, he said, which meant something underground was feeding it. The provincial government in Edmonton had been talking, quietly, about a railway spur through the Peace River Valley. A railway needed water to run the steam engines. A railway needed level ground and river access both. Edmund had refused to sell twice. Robert had refused to sell once 6 weeks before he died. Mavis sat by the stove with her hands in her lap and the oil lamp burning low, and she thought about the ice of the halfway river and a careful man who checked his footing twice and a river that disagreed with him anyway. She was still sitting there when Gareth Kane's hand shot out and closed around her wrist. She did not scream. She was too tired to scream. She looked at him steadily, her heart hammering, and waited. His eyes were open, dark, fever-glassed, but aware. He took in the cabin, the stove, the sleeping child in the corner, her blood-stained hands, the satchel on the table. Some rapid calculation moved behind his eyes, and then the grip on her wrist eased. "You're not one of Hargrove's people," he said. "Not a question." "I'm Mavis Tully," she said. "This is my claim. You were bleeding out in my trapline trail. I dragged you here." A long pause. His eyes moved to her hands again. "How bad?" "Through and through, high under the arm. I stitched it. You have a fever, and you're going to feel like you lost a fight with a moose for about a week. But you'll probably live." She paused. "I read your papers, Mr. Kane." He went very still. "I needed to know," she said, "whether the men who shot you were going to follow you to my door." Gareth Kane looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he let out a slow, careful breath. "2 of them," he said. "I lost them above the ridge when the storm came in. They won't track in the dark, not in this weather." He paused. "I'm sorry. I brought this to your house. You didn't choose to get shot. I chose to come this way." His voice was thin with pain. "The South Trail was watched. Your claim was the only structure I knew was on the North Line." He looked at her steadily. "Hargrove sent those men to take the satchel. What's in it is the only thing stopping him from filing a fraudulent claim on the North Quarter before the Dominion office processes the legitimate survey." "The railway," Mavis said quietly. He blinked. Whatever he'd expected her to say, it wasn't that. "My father-in-law has been saying for 30 years that this river runs fed from below," Mavis continued. "My husband refused to sell the claim. Twice before he died, Hargrove's agent came here." She stopped. "My husband fell through river ice he'd crossed 100 times." The silence in the cabin was very specific. "I can't prove anything," Gareth said after a moment. "No," Mavis agreed, "but you can tell me what those papers say," he told her. The Geological Survey had found what Edmund Tully's instinct had always told him was there, a subterranean aquifer feeding the North Fork of the Peace, sufficient to supply a full railway division point, worth more to the Canadian Pacific's Northern Spur project than every timber lot in the district combined. Hargrove had known about it for 2 years. He had been quietly acquiring the surrounding lots, leaving the Tully claim, the one with direct surface access to the aquifer, for last. When Edmund refused to sell a 3rd time, Hargrove had arranged for his own survey, falsifying the Dominion office filing date to preempt Gareth's legitimate assessment. All of it was in the satchel. All of it was evidence. And Gareth Kane was lying on her floor with a bullet hole in him, and Mavis was the only person in 40 miles who knew any of it. She boiled more water. She fed the stove. She sent Percy to bed and sat back down by the man on her floor and thought about her husband and the ice and whether God or luck or something meaner had sent a bleeding surveyor down her trapline trail at the right moment. Edmund Tully came home on the morning of the 17th, 2 days late, his left ear frostbitten, and his marten traps empty, and his temper entirely foul. He stopped in the doorway of his own cabin, stared at the large stranger occupying his floor rug, and looked at his daughter-in-law. "Mavis Edmund," she said, handing him a cup of tea. "There is a man on my floor. There is. His name is Gareth Kane. He's a government surveyor. Someone shot him, and he's been unconscious for 2 days, but his fever broke this morning, which I'm taking as a good sign. Sit down, please. I need to tell you something about the North Quarter and a railway. Edmund sat down. He listened. He was a man who, in 71 years, had learned when to ask questions and when to simply listen, and this was clearly a listening situation. By the time Mavis finished, his face was the color of old ash. "Robert," he said. "Just the name. Nothing else." "I don't know," Mavis said carefully. "But I think we need to." Gareth recovered with the particular stubbornness of a man accustomed to being damaged by the outdoors. By the 3rd day he was sitting up. By the 5th he had dragged himself to the table and was reviewing his papers with Edmund. The two of them bent over the survey maps, while Percy crept closer by degrees, fascinated by the precise and mysterious lines. Gareth explained them patiently: watershed markers, elevation contours, the little triangle symbols that meant the surveyor had stood here, right here, and measured this exact piece of earth. "What's that one?" Percy asked, pointing to a mark beside the river. "That one," Gareth said, "is your grandfather's land. That mark means the water source is directly beneath it." He looked at the boy seriously. "Which means your grandfather owns something very valuable." Percy looked at Edmund. "Is that good?" "Depends," Edmund said, "on whether the wrong person finds out first." On the evening of the 6th day, they did. Mavis was at the stove when Percy, who had been watching the south trail from the window as Gareth had taught him, said in a very small voice, "Mama, horses." Mavis wiped her hands on her apron. Gareth was already on his feet, moving with the stiff, careful deliberateness of a man whose stitches would not forgive sudden motion. He checked the Remington without needing to think about it, the motion automatic as breathing. "How many?" Edmund asked Percy. "4 horses. And a cutter." Percy pressed closer to the glass. "There's a fat man in a big coat in the cutter." Edmund's jaw tightened. "That'll be Hargrove." Mavis looked at the satchel on the table. She looked at Gareth. "Cellar," Gareth said, low and clear. "Not for me," Mavis said. He looked at her. "Percy goes down," she said. "Edmund and I are on this claim. We answer the door. You stay out of sight until I tell you otherwise." She met his eyes steadily. "If it goes wrong, you have the papers and you know what to do with them. If it doesn't go wrong, we won't need you." Gareth Kane, who had spent 12 years surveying some of the most unforgiving landscape in British North America and had considered himself a fair judge of what people were made of, looked at Mavis Tully for a long moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. Percy went down the cellar ladder, without argument for the first time in his small life. Mavis covered the trapdoor with the hide rug and set the kettle on the stove and opened the cabin door before the knock came. Cecil Hargrove was a heavy man in his early 60s, pink-faced from the cold and from a lifetime of good meals. He wore a buffalo coat with a fur collar and a hat that had not come from any catalog west of Toronto. 2 men flanked him, large, flat-eyed, the kind who are hired for their dimensions rather than their conversation. A 3rd man waited by the horses, his collar turned up. "Mrs. Tully," Hargrove said, with the particular warmth of a man who has already decided how this ends, "I hope we haven't come at an inconvenient time. I heard you'd had some trouble up here. I wanted to come myself, make sure you and the boy were managing." "We're managing fine," Mavis said. "What do you want, Mr. Hargrove?" His smile thinned slightly. "I have a new offer for the claim. Very generous given the season. I thought, with Edmund getting on in years and Robert gone, God rest him, it might be time to think seriously about the future." "We've given you our answer twice," Edmund said from behind Mavis's shoulder. "Circumstances change, Edmund." Hargrove's eyes moved around the cabin's interior. The 2 cups on the table, the extra marlin on the wall rack that he would recognize as neither Edmund's nor Mavis's, the particular arrangement of things that suggested a 3rd person. "I understand there may have been a stranger through this area recently. Trouble follows certain kinds of men. I'd hate to think that sort of difficulty had found its way to your door." "Our door is our business," Mavis said flatly. Hargrove let the smile drop entirely. It was a relief, in a way. The pretense had always been the most unpleasant part. "That surveyor," he said quietly. "Kane. He was carrying documents that belonged to me. Documents relevant to a filing I've made with the Dominion Land Office. If those documents have found their way here, returning them would be the wisest possible thing you could do." For everyone, Mavis looked at him. She thought about Robert on the ice. She thought about Edmund's face when she had said his son's name. "I don't know anything about any documents," she said. "I think you should leave." Hargrove's expression went flat and cold in a way that had probably worked on smaller people in smaller rooms. He opened his mouth to speak. "Mr. Hargrove." Gareth Kane stepped out from the back room doorway, the Remington easy in his hands, his face still pale from blood loss but his voice entirely steady. "My name is Gareth Kane. I'm a licensed surveyor with the Dominion Land Survey Office, and I'm still alive, which I expect is a surprise to you." He reached into his parka with his left hand and produced a folded document with an official seal. "This is a signed affidavit, witnessed and dated, documenting the false filing you made with the Ottawa office, the alteration of the survey boundary maps, and the names of the 2 men you sent to the North Ridge on the 12th of November." He paused. "One of them talked, Mr. Hargrove. People will when the other option is a federal charge." The color left Hargrove's face by degrees like water draining from a basin. "Additionally," Gareth continued, "there is a completed copy of the legitimate hydrological survey for Peace River District, lots 7 through 22, in the custody of the RCMP detachment in Grande Prairie, delivered by a rider I sent out 2 days ago." He lowered the rifle. "The Dominion office will receive the original this spring. The North Quarter water rights belong to the Tully claim. The railway will know who to deal with." He looked at Hargrove steadily. "I'd strongly recommend you get back in your cutter and drive south." Hargrove stood in the doorway of the cabin for a long moment. One of his large men shifted his weight. Gareth did not look at the large man. He looked only at Hargrove with the particular calm of someone who has already settled the question in his own mind. Hargrove got back in his cutter. They watched from the window as it disappeared down the south trail, taking the flat-eyed men with it. Edmund sat down heavily in his chair. Percy came up from the cellar on his own, having apparently decided the situation was concluded, and climbed directly into his great-grandfather's lap without asking permission. "Did we win?" Percy asked. "Something like that," Edmund said, his voice not entirely steady. Mavis stood at the window long after the cutter had gone, her arms crossed against the cold that still leaked through the old glass. Behind her, she heard Gareth lower himself carefully back into the chair by the stove, heard the long exhale of a man whose body has been reminding him of its opinions. "You said there was a rider," Mavis said, without turning. 2 days ago." Edmund went. Gareth said, "While you were sleeping." She turned. Edmund met her eyes briefly and then became very interested in the top of Percy's head. "You could have told me," she said. "You had enough to carry," Edmund said. Mavis looked at the old man and the boy in the chair, and then at the surveyor by her stove, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for 14 months. The RCMP constable from Grande Prairie arrived on the 21st with 2 officers and a warrant. Cecil Hargrove was arrested at his house in town. The 2 men from the North Ridge were already in custody. The formal charges took the better part of an hour for the constable to read aloud, and he was not a fast reader. Mavis made tea and listened to all of it. The inquest into Robert Tully's death was reopened in the spring. It did not reach a verdict that provided the satisfaction of a clear answer. These things rarely did, but it established enough irregularity in the circumstances that no one in the Peace River Valley was left wondering. People knew. Sometimes that had to be enough. The railway offer arrived in June, carried by a man in a good suit, who had come up from Edmonton specifically to speak with Mrs. Tully and to examine the survey documents Gareth Kane had filed with the Dominion office in April. The offer was not an insult. Mavis made him wait 3 days before she answered, because Edmund said she should, and because she had found, in the 14 months since Robert died, that patience was a form of power she had not previously understood. She did not sell, she leased the water access. The distinction mattered to her in a way she did not fully explain to the railway man, who accepted the terms anyway, because the alternative was building his steam station somewhere else. The money arrived in the autumn, enough for a new roof, glass in all the windows, and a winter's supplies that did not require arithmetic. Gareth Kane had left in March, when the passes cleared, with his satchel and his Remington and a new sealskin parka that Mavis had made for him over the winter because his old one was ruined. He was heading east to the next survey contract, the next unmapped section of an enormous country that needed someone to walk it with careful eyes and an honest hand. He had stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and said that in 12 years of wilderness survey work he had laid his bedroll in a great many places, but that none of them had felt quite the way a home felt. He had stopped there. Mavis had looked at him for a long moment. The Northern Survey District, she said carefully, goes as far west as the Peace River Valley. It does, he said. You'd need a base camp, somewhere to winter. A surveyor generally would. The spring wind moved through the spruce trees at the edge of the claim, carrying the smell of meltwater and dark earth and the faint green suggestion of a season that was finally, after everything, arriving. I suppose, Mavis said, the eastern valleys can wait. Percy, who had been leaning in the doorway listening to all of this with the frank attention of a 7-year-old who has decided he is not going to pretend he isn't listening, looked up at Gareth Kane and said, "Does that mean you're staying?" Gareth looked at Mavis. Mavis looked back at him, steady and unhurried, with the particular patience of a woman who has learned that good things sometimes arrive bleeding in the snow and simply require the courage to drag them home. I reckon, Gareth said slowly, a quiet light crossing his weathered face, the eastern valleys can wait a good while yet.